Welcome to a brand new episode of No Truths Barred, the best up and coming podcast on the internet. And I'm your host, Toykaweku Timmons. And I want to thank you guys for tuning in once again. And if you've missed any of the previous 65 episodes, those episodes can be found on YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. And also, I'd like to thank everybody that's contributed a piece of constructive criticism, any sort of support, sharing, any particular video clip, providing, comments on any of the content that I post. I deeply, deeply thank you. And also make sure you subscribe to the No Truths Barred YouTube channel. So to jump into today's podcast, I want to say this is a great honor. I have a powerful scholar on today. I actually met this gentleman at the Marcus Garvey symposium about 5 or 6 years ago. And it was a powerful symposium. And honestly, what we're going to talk about today related to Garvey, it's just kind of a synopsis and overview and things that, he brought up in his book that I think people can really take a lot from, because honestly, you could do probably a 10-hour class on Marcus Garvey when you're looking at all of the various things you're talking about his impact here in the US, in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Asia. There's so many different ways you can go. So let me jump into this, and I'm going to allow the doctor to introduce himself. I have Dr. Adam Ewing on today. He received his PhD in history from Harvard University in 2011. Before joining the Department of African American Studies at VCU in 2014, he served as a Mellon Postdoctorate Fellow at Johns Hopkins University and also a Mellon Assistant Professor at Vanderbilt University as well. He's also the writer of The Age of Garvey. Make sure you check this out if you have any interest in learning about Marcus Garvey, his movement and his impact, not just here in the United States, but globally. Please, please, please check this out. And so without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Adam Ewing. Thank you for coming on today, sir. If there's anything you'd like to add about yourself or, where you come from, please do.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here. You're absolutely right that it's going to be hard to talk about all of the facets of Garveyism in one conversation. It's sort of a lifetime's worth of work when you talk about the breadth and the complexity of the movement. Thank you for that very nice introduction. I'm not sure what I'd add, except I grew up in Canada. I think that's sort of an important part of how I got here. Garveyism in Canada is a topic that hasn't been dealt with nearly enough. So yeah, it's great to be here.
Yeah, and I felt like to that particular point, because a lot of times my research from Garvey is more so from the vantage point. I'm looking at Harlem, I'm looking at the chapters of the U.N.I.A here in Virginia. And another thing, right, it's getting talked about more, but I think Garvey's impact in the South, I don't think it's something that we talk about a lot. A lot of times we really focus on like the Northeast, maybe like the Caribbean, but from my research, I see that he had like a huge impact in the South as well. And so I want to jump right into it. The Age of Garvey, I think this is, going through this book, to me, it's right up there with like Tony Martin's work, Rupert Lewis. I mean, just a real powerful work on Garvey. And so I want to know essentially, what inspired you to write and do the research for the Age of Garvey? And the second question is, there's a lot of great work out there, powerful names like the people I just mentioned. What do you feel that this particular work added to the research field when it comes to Marcus Garvey?
Wow. Yeah, so I got interested in Garveyism in graduate school. I was taking a seminar with my advisor, the great Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who currently is the president of ASALA, the organization that Carter G. Woodson founded. So I was taking a course with her, and for the course I had to write a research paper, and I wanted to look into Garveyism because I was looking for models of effective grassroots organizing, and particularly how national and international organizations are able to mobilize local political efforts and really engage people politically. And Garveyism is a great, maybe the best example of that. So I wanted to study Garveyism. My university also had a nearly complete run of the Negro World, Garvey's paper, and so I could read through those journals, and I was absolutely captivated doing so. But the other reason why I wanted to focus on Garveyism was that I had known the outlines of Garvey's story coming into the project. What was amazing for me to find out was how much Garvey and Garveyism are erased from the mainstream, predominantly white narrative of history and Black history. And it was shocking for me to I'm, as you said, I'm coming from Harvard. I'm being sort of educated, or you could say, inculcated into a view of history. Even someone's focusing on African American history, inculcated into a view in which Garveyism really wasn't a part of that story, or Garveyism was a sideshow. And I was, and as you say, there were a lot of, and continue to be a lot of people doing incredible work on Garveyism, but the master narrative kept Garvey out. And I the more I researched into Garveyism and the more important I saw Garveyism as being in this history, the more that really stuck out. And I really wanted to make a contribution to changing that.
Yeah, and when you were speaking just now about Garvey and him being erased from mainstream history, it's funny because I look at, and we can get into this later in the podcast, like, for example, take someone like Malcolm X, who literally would not exist without Marcus Garvey because his parents met when they were in the UNIA. And there's something that's not talked about as well as the influence of Marcus Garvey on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so it's funny to me that I had to really go to college and I had to step away from the public education system to really get that understanding of Garvey. If you could speculate, why do you feel that is in such a monumental figure, not just in United States history, but just really globally? Why do you feel that his story and his history, his impact really isn't talked about that much?
Yeah, well, I think there's a different answer depending on where you're talking about. But in the United States specifically, it's important to note that Black people and people doing research in Black history have always been writing about Marcus Garvey. That's the first thing. And you mentioned some really important names, right? Tony Martin's Race First is a classic that was written, my goodness, almost 50 years ago now.
Yeah.
Rupert Lewis was organizing these incredible conferences in the 1980s. There's a couple of people, and I was influenced by a host of different scholars: Emory Tolbert, John Henry Clark, Randall Burkett, Barbara Baer, Ula Taylor, people doing amazing work. Robert A. Hill, the editor of the Marcus Garvey papers, who pulled together an archive that allows scholars like myself to do research on the global impact of Garveyism, and I think is the most sort of insightful living scholar of Garveyism, and probably the most insightful ever. He was incredibly important. Amy Jakes Garvey, Marcus Garvey's second wife, doesn't get considered in this tradition of writing and preserving the memory and being a historian of the Garvey movement. When she wrote Garvey and Garveyism in 1963, she had to self-publish that book, and that book was derided by white scholars. There was a scholar that wrote the first biography of Garvey, David Cronin. And Amy Jakes Garvey opened up her archive to David Cronin, and he got all this incredible access to these files, and then wrote an incredibly insulting and derogatory book about Garvey and Garveyism. And he considered Amy Jakes Garvey's work to be just sort of like memoir writing rather than history writing. But if you look back at Garvey and Garveyism, this is an incredible history of the movement. And of course, Amy Jakes Garvey also was editing the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey. So the first thing is, there are people doing this work. But in the United States, in the 1960s, the academy, the predominantly white academy, was very much shaped by integrationist politics. And for the first time in the 60s, the doors of these institutions were opened wide to Black scholars and to Black students, on the condition that a very narrow perspective of Black history was pursued, and these institutions were very much wedded to the narrative of integration, of civil rights, and were very threatened by Garveyism and connected to this Black studies, because Black studies was coming in and offering a perspective which has been much more widely accepted now. But which was really critical of sort of the efforts of an integrationist politics that was viewed as inadequate, Garvey was a hero for a lot of these scholars. And there was a concerted effort in the late 1960s and early 1970s to suppress these perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also the Black Power era, and that's viewed as very threatening. So you have these scholars that on the one hand are these white scholars that are starting to bring Black history into the mainstream story, but in this very narrow lens that excludes Black nationalism, that excludes radical Black power, that excludes Garvey. And I think that explains a lot of the erasure. And it's taken decades to get back to the point where Garvey is taken more seriously in that community. But of course, as I said originally, Garvey has always been incredibly taken very seriously by people that just haven't been in that sort of elite white space.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And it's funny that, you mentioned John Henry Clark, because I have a few works of his and he does great detail to talking about the UNIA. And then, Garvey and Garveyism, that was one of the things that caught me when I read that book, because it was an amazing book on the UNIA. And I kind of could feel that it wasn't treated with that degree of the same seriousness as maybe a Tony Martin. And once again, Tony Martin's a brilliant historian, not taking nothing away. But yeah, Garvey and Garveyism was a huge work. But I want to kind of move on to the next thing, because I know I don't have you for too long. So when you look at Garvey, we think about the concept of Pan-Africanism. He was not the originator of it. You have people prior to him, you have people like Martin Delany, you had Bishop Henry Neal Turner, you had Henry Sylvester Williams, amongst many others. And to a degree, you could look at W.E.B. Du Bois as being Pan-African as well, just kind of in a different capacity and juxtaposition of Garvey. And as we all know, that rivalry between, Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois. But what I want to ask you, we have this thought process, we have this idea for the need of repatriation, or if not full repatriation, connecting with Africa. What was the difference? Why do you feel like Garvey made more of an impact versus his predecessors? Because you have brilliant people before, you have people that did great works. You had the other gentleman that went to Liberia, and I can't remember his name at the moment, Edward Blyden. Yeah, you have people like that, really brilliant people, but what do you think Garvey did that was different versus his predecessors when it comes to Pan-Africanism?
Yeah, the connection between Garvey and Garveyism and Pan-Africanism is so important. But I think, and you've listed a number of really important predecessors to Garvey. I think Pan-Africanism in general is a concept that is often misunderstood, at least in my view. And I think in order to understand sort of what Garvey did that was different, it's also really important to understand the shoulders that Garvey stepped on, that lifted Garvey and that made Garveyism possible. Pan-Africanism comes out of this tremendous historical transformation in the Atlantic world, right? Which is Europeans colonizing and clearing the land through genocide, the Americas, and then bringing in huge numbers enslaved Africans forcibly over to the Americas in order to enrich themselves, to produce material on that land that created this incredible political and economic strength for Europe, right? And so you have this situation where before those events, the Atlantic world is in general a place where people are living with a similar quality of life in the Americas, in Africa, in Europe. And through those transformations, through that exploitation, and through the rise of this sort of racial hierarchy, but you have this incredible inequality produced, and also this world in which Europeans are absorbing American, right, indigenous and African people into this racial hierarchy, stripping them from their societies and bringing them into this world as subordinate and perpetual hewers of wood and drawers of water. And this is the context of Pan-Africanism, right? Because people that are stripped from their diverse communities in Africa find themselves in the New World, in the Americas, in this situation where for the first time they're identifying as African rather than as whatever, where they come from, their ethnic group. They're finding commonalities in terms of sort of shared or similar religious practices, similar cultural practices, similar social institutions. And so, as you say, like it is this politics of connection and trying to both find connection in the past, but also to find connection through a shared history of struggle. But on the other hand, it is also a politics of refusal. Because what Pan-Africanists are saying is that this world that is being created by Europeans, in which there is this single center, right, with white people on top and Black people on the bottom, in which Black people are enslaved and white people are free, this colonial relationship is inadequate, and it must be refused. And Black space, Black self-determination must be created in order to emancipate Black people from the bondage of this system, both during slavery and after slavery. And this is the tradition of the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica, the tradition of the Maroons, right? This is the tradition that Garvey grows up with. And he's reading those texts, but he's also living this history, right? Garvey's father claimed Maroon heritage, right? The Maroons are a group of people in Jamaica that fled from the plantations, right, rejected the logic of this Euro-centered society and built these independent African-centered communities in the hills of Jamaica. Garvey's father was also involved in the planning or in the politics leading up to the Morant Bay Rebellion, this great rebellion that sought to overturn white rule in Jamaica in 1865. Garvey's tutor, Robert Love, met Henry Sylvester Williams and is this key Pan-African figure in Jamaica. Garvey grows up in the shop of Alfred Cat Burroughs, his godfather, which is this hub of Pan-African discourse. So Garvey grows up in this tradition. And then, like many West Indians, right, Garvey travels around the world in the late 19th century, early 20th century, which is also really important to understanding the spread of Garveyism. So Garvey is immersed in this politics of both connection and refusal. The thing that Garvey did that was different was really, Garvey emerged in this World War I period where Europe has been torn apart. And Garvey takes this prophetic tradition of Pan-Africanism, right, based on the Psalm 68:31. Princes shall come out of Egypt, Ethiopia shall stretch her hands forth unto God, and says, look, the time is now. The time to bring together the scattered sons and daughters of Ethiopia is right now. He says, Black people have missed this opportunity with World War I. The world is in revolt. There's revolution in Russia. There's revolution in Asia. There's revolution in the Middle East. Workers all over the world are rising up. Garvey says, Black people were not organized and prepared for this moment. And it is absolutely essential for Black people the world over to wake up to the need to organize and prepare, because another conflict is coming. And if Black people are not prepared, they may lose the opportunity for liberation forever. And this is what Garvey does to catalyze this tradition of trying to emancipate Black people from this European world system, and to give it the urgency of the post-World War I era. And of course, Garvey is prophetic here, right? Because there is another conflict a generation later with World War II, and Black people are more mobilized in many respects because of the work that Garveyism has done, and there is that then move toward liberation politics and decolonization.
Let me ask, speaking of Garvey, and you were talking about his influences, it's great that you mentioned Dr. Robert Love, because I was legitimately about to ask about that. But I also want to talk about a little bit about Dr. Booker T. Washington, which is his work Up from Slavery really had a profound impact on Garvey. And as we know, W.E.B. Du Bois had his issues with Dr. Booker T. Washington. Well, I want to ask you, when we're looking at the political agenda of Marcus Garvey, and we see what he's trying to do. For those that don't know or may not be aware of the fact that W. Du Bois was extremely critical of Marcus Garvey and his movement, can you briefly talk about what exactly was it that Du Bois was critical of when it came to Marcus Garvey?
Yeah, I mean, they didn't like each other at all. They insulted each other. Du Bois, right, ultimately reached this point where he was participating in the Garvey must go campaign, doing everything that he could to get Garvey arrested and deported. And Garvey called Du Bois all kinds of names as well. I mean, it's a complicated story, but I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that Du Bois saw Garvey as a usurper, that Du Bois felt that he was the rightful bearer of sort of Pan-African politics. He was, Du Bois was a very, classically educated man, and felt that Garvey was making appeals, appeals to the worst instincts of people. He felt that Garveyism was irrational. He was very critical of the Black Star Line, which he thought was swindling people. He was, I think, very, very threatened by Garvey's ability to gather a mass audience around him. And so I think, a lot of the disagreement just came from the heat of that competition. Du Bois was with the NAACP, and after World War I, it looked like the NAACP might be a mass organization that really attracted a wide Black audience. And then Garvey came in, and his organization just swept everyone away. And I think a lot of it was competition. Later in Du Bois's life, he expressed sort of perspectives that were aligned with Garveyism in interesting ways. He explored the idea of separatism. I think a lot of, and this is true of a lot of opponents of Garvey, people like George Padmore that said all kinds of nasty things about Garvey, or C.L.R. James, who later sort of came to recognize what Garvey had actually accomplished. So I think that's a large part of it.
And please correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't A. Philip Randolph like a critic of Garvey as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, A. Philip Randolph was a socialist and really thought that liberation must proceed along these sort of scientific lines. Mm-hmm. And Garvey just did things differently. And so that was a similar perspective to Du Bois.
Yeah. And I mentioned this when I emailed you, and this is something I've had conversations with, and I want, you're a scholar in this, so I want you to clarify the whole concept. Now, I think you kind of answered this earlier in your response, but just to kind of go into it a little bit more, Pan-Africanism, that what we title Pan-Africanism. I've had conversations with people that said that sort of ideology was already starting to begin on the continent post-Berlin Conference, and that it would have grown there without the influence of figures from the diaspora. And I've always just kind of taken, from my point of view and my research thus far, is that this concept that we call Pan-Africanism very much started out in the diaspora. And so it's just a little point I just wanted to bring up in this particular podcast.
Yeah, Pan-Africanism, in my view, starts in the diaspora.
Okay.
And like I said, it's because first of all, you have for the first time people identifying as African rather than as Yoruba or Bakongo or one of the many different societies in Africa itself. But also the thing about Pan-Africanism is that everyone has a different definition, and I think what's going to be really important moving forward, and I want to try to do this in some of my work moving forward, is to really sort of clarify what Pan-Africanism is as a politics. But as I said, I think that it is really important to understand that Pan-Africanism emerges within the framework of European hegemony. It is sort of the creation of European power that provides the response of Pan-Africanism, which is, in my view, a project of overturning, and it is an anti-colonial project that is dedicated to overturning world white supremacy and restoring conditions of equality between Africans and Europeans, which is very much what Garvey was seeking. And the simple fact of the matter is that Pan-Africanism developed later in Africa because Africa was not colonized. People until the late 19th century, early 20th century in most parts of the continent. And so it was among people that were forcibly brought to the Americas that developed a liberation politics to overturn these white, these white dominated societies that were the progenitors of Pan-Africanism. Later, when Africa was colonized, Africans did remarkable work to innovate and to develop the tradition of Pan-Africanism. So the distinction that I would make is I'd say, look, there was really important resistance to European encroachments in Africa before and during the time that Pan-Africanism was being developed in the Americas. But I wouldn't call those forms of resistance Pan-Africanism.
Yeah, I agree, because even if, one of the examples I've heard used is like when you look at the Mahdi in Sudan that raised up against the British, or you look at someone like Samori Touré, in I think in Guinea-Bissau, that led this big revolution against the French. Those movements, they were rebellion, but I don't think it was based upon the line of identifying as African to fight against these colonial powers. So I definitely see that point. To move along, I want to talk a little. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I apologize.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, but when you get to people like Kwame Nkrumah and Frantz Fanon and Amilcar Cabral, but when you get to that period, right, Africans are taking up the mantle of Pan-African liberation politics.
Yes, very much so. And I want to touch on that later on. And so I want to read a quote from your book, which I found was very powerful. And I have a question about this. Stated, research has made clear that the UNIA was not the mere province of the urban American North as it was once portrayed, but a global movement that established local divisions across the United States, Canada, through the Caribbean archipelago, and into the Central American Isthmus. My question is, and I stated this a little bit earlier, could you explain a little bit more about Garvey's impact in the American South? Because it's something that I feel is talked about, but I think a lot of times the focus really isn't placed there. And I think from one of Tony Martin's works, I believe it was either Hampton or Newport News that had over 48 chapters of the UNIA. I think one of the second largest chapters. Chattanooga, Tennessee had many chapters of the UNIA. So if you could talk like maybe about that rural impact that Garvey had in the South.
Absolutely, and you're right. One of the major centers of Garveyism in the United States was in the Hampton, the Hampton Roads area, the 757. There, rural Louisiana and New Orleans, Garveyism was incredibly important. The thing is, wherever there were Black people in the 1920s, Garveyism was important. That's the remarkable thing about the movement. But Garveyism was very popular in the South. I think it, in part because, in my view, in the 1920s in the South, political organizing was very fraught. The NAACP, after this, as I said, this brief recruiting drive after World War I, is sort of driven away by the Klan and by a resurgent white supremacy. And Garveyism Garveyites as they move into the United States, into the American South, are presenting to people organizing in these rural communities a politics which is practical, because it is not immediately striking at the foundations of white power in the United States, but also incredibly compelling, because the argument that Garveyites are making is compelling everywhere, which is that, look, the focus is to build strength. We need to do this however we can. Right? Garveyism really empowered local communities and said, look, you know the conditions here better than anywhere else. Our goal is African liberation, which will lead to Black liberation. How do you go about that here? And empowered local communities, and it focused on institution building and consciousness raising, and again on this idea, which was incredibly powerful in the South and elsewhere, which was that Black people, Garveyites all over the world, and anti-colonial activists all over the world were organizing. They were gathering strength. That white supremacy was in its dying days, so long as people mobilized and spread the word and shared knowledge. And so it was an incredibly compelling message. it empowered Black people in the South, in urban and rural communities, to sort of build on the knowledge that they already had about what was politically possible, and it focused on institution building, and it presented this incredible narrative of liberation that was incredibly empowering. It was also strategic, right? Garvey was criticized for the intelligentsia for meeting with the Klan. Right, he met with the acting imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan in 1922, and Garvey's critics in the North said, "Well, this is crazy. Why are you talking to the Klan?" Well, Garveyites were having conversations all the time about how to best navigate around the challenges of white violence, and Garvey's perspective was, we have to be mindful of this power. We have to speak to this power. We have to recognize that for people living in the rural South, the Klan is the United States. The Klan is, what Garvey said, the invisible government of the United States, and we need to start from those premises and not hide behind any sort of vision of what any rosy vision of what the United States might be.
Yeah, and that was something he received huge criticism for, especially people like we listed earlier, like Du Bois and others, which is like really critical of him meeting with the Ku Klux Klan. But in his own capacity, it was very forward thinking. I want to speak a little bit about the Negro World, the paper of the UNIA. But actually, before I get to that, you mentioned Amy Jacks Garvey. But one of the things I found profound about the UNIA was the powerful positions held by women. And, you look at parts of the UNIA, like the Black Cross nurses and what they were about, what they did. I think Maggie Walker supported the UNIA. So it was that was something that I found unique for its time, to have a lot of women in powerful positions that directed and created and contributed to the overall organizing of the UNIA. Is that something you could, speak to briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. The UNIA provided a remarkable number of opportunities for female-centered leadership within the organization. I mean, a lot of the official rhetoric of the organization was patriarchal and sort of conceptual, conceived of liberation in male-centered terms. A lot of the men that were in the organization were misogynistic, as many were then, and many are now. But the remarkable thing about the UNIA was that it provided a forum and it provided a platform, and Black women stepped in and they made claims. They said, this is our organization. They expanded the rhetoric and the philosophy of Garveyism. They emerged as central leaders: Amy Jacks Garvey, Madame Demina, Henrietta Vinton Davis, but local leaders across the country as well. And not only women stepping into leadership roles, and not only across the country, but across the world, in Central America and the West Indies, not only women, but also working class Black men and women. Right? Garveyism provided leadership and opportunities and a space for political activism of people from all different classes. It provided this space for women activists. It provided a community. Again, the politics of refusal in Pan-Africanism is a politics of creating separate and liberated space for Black consciousness raising and organization building. And the UNIA provided this space, this liberated territory. And within this territory, all Black people, and the UNIA brought in everyone, from preachers and lawyers to laborers, men and women, everyone came into the UNIA. And within this liberated space, they began negotiating new forms of relations. And women were at the forefront of saying, look, any vision of liberation that Garveyism is promoting must have women at the center of it. And women in the Garvey movement were pioneers in articulating sort of early varieties of what became Black feminism.
And you spoke about the fact that the UNIA and the Garvey movement, it appealed to many of the masses of the working class, which when I look at early Du Bois and his concept of the talented 10th, it's just like a stark contrast. And to me, one of my opinions, I feel like Du Bois in a way was really kind of aloof from the commoner. his perspective, his modality on specific things, it may not have appealed to the masses of people. But I want to jump into the Negro World, that particular paper. One of the things I wanted to get into was the intellectual impact of Garveyism. So I know with the Negro World, you have people like Joel Augustus Rogers, who contributed pieces. Earlier on, Hubert Harrison, he contributed pieces. I think he was the editor for the Negro World at one point.
For a time,
then you had Carter G. Woodson, a few other people that contributed to the Negro World. And so I want to ask you, we talk about politics, and we talk about a lot of different other facets of the U.N.I.A. and the Garvey movement. What was the impact of that particular paper when it comes to introducing Black intelligentsia, its work as a piece of, because there were historical pieces written in the UNIA, in the Negro World as well. And so what was the intellectual impact of that paper?
Yeah, and let me just go back and say, I think you're right about Du Bois. And I think that's actually part of the answer for the impact of the Negro World. I mean, Du Bois started with the talented 10th, and later on, he really, he embraced the idea of sort of working class, and he ended a Pan-African communist, right? So he really sort of changed his view on sort of the elite. But you're right, he was always an elitist and sort of and held aloof. And one of the innovations, the intellectual innovations of Garveyism was to produce a Pan-Africanism that did not disdain or look down upon the people, that really started from and worked within and spoke within the languages of Black people across the board, not just elite people. There's a scholar that wrote this essay on Garvey once, Lawrence Levine, who said that the thing about Garvey was that he preached in the right syllables. It wasn't, if you read Du Bois, you can see some of the same arguments that Garvey's making. There's overlap, but Garvey was speaking in a way that people heard, and he was speaking in a way that communicated with people and felt that they were not being looked down on, which a lot of the intelligentsia was doing in their language, and doing so in making fun of Garvey's followers, calling them ignorant dupes and calling them unlettered and calling them ignorant and backward. Garvey was not disdaining people. Garvey was saying, our intellectual tradition is something that is inclusive of all of us. And that, I think, in many ways, that is part of the intellectual legacy of the Negro World. So on the one hand, you're right. Like Garvey gives a platform to all of these different people. Hubert Harrison, brilliant man, like Black Socrates.
Black Socrates, yeah.
William Ferris, Duze Muhammad Ali is editing the paper for a while, another really important figure. Joel Rogers, as you're saying, Eric Walrond. But it's also providing a space for this popular Black Pan-African consciousness that goes out on the pages of the Negro World every week and travels, right, is taken by Black sailors and hidden on ships and travels all over the world and spreads this narrative of an empowered Blackness, right? The Negro World just bleeds Black pride. Black people are strong. Black people are powerful. Black people, once they awaken to the conditions of their bondage and organize, there is nothing that cannot be accomplished. And liberation is just a matter of doing that work. That message travels all over the world and influences countless numbers of people.
Really quick, because you mentioned Duce Muhammad Ali, and he's a figure that I've started to study a little bit more over the past few years. And this is something that I guess maybe this is a question for me personally, as opposed to the listeners. When you look at Duce Muhammad Ali, could you say, because I've been conflicted on this, can you say that he was an influence on Garvey or more so of a contemporary? Because I think he was only like 11 years older than Garvey, I believe. And I know I think he was born in Egypt. I think he was based in, I think he met Garvey in London, I believe. And then later on, he would go to Nigeria to start a paper in Nigeria. So could you call Duce Muhammad Ali an influence on Garvey or just more so a contemporary?
Well, I would say influence and contemporary, because
Okay.
once the UNIA is the biggest thing in town, Duse Muhammad Ali comes to the United States and is editing the paper for a brief time. But yeah, when Garvey went to London in the 1910s, he worked at Duse Muhammad Ali's incredibly influential paper, the Africa Times and Orient Review, which in many ways was a precursor to the Negro World. Duse Muhammad Ali was a businessman and an incredible propagandist. And his, if you read the African Times and Orient Review, similarly to the Negro World, it has reporters all over the world. It is reporting news from Asia and Africa and the Americas, and bringing it together into a shared narrative, which is connecting the struggles of Black people and non-white people all over the world. Garvey learned, I think, a tremendous amount from that newspaper, and wrote a famous essay in that newspaper. So I think the influence of Duse Muhammad Ali is really felt there. Of course, Duse Muhammad Ali was also an entrepreneur, and I don't know that this is the case, but I imagine that Garvey also was inspired by that, and Garvey, of course, created the Black Star Line and all of these business adventures, which were very much in line with the way that Duse Muhammad Ali approached Pan-Africanism.
The other thing briefly I want to kind of briefly cover is when you talk about the Garvey Must Go campaign, you look at that, but then on another degree, you had people like J. Edgar Hoover, that wanted him gone from the country. And I believe that was like one of the first big cases of the Bureau of Investigation, was investigating the UNIA and Marcus Garvey. To those that don't know, could you speak to the, I guess, like the war, that J. Edgar Hoover set on Marcus Garvey?
Yeah, so Garvey was Hoover's big break. J. Edgar Hoover was assigned the task at the Bureau of Investigations, which became the FBI, was assigned the task of getting Garvey. By 1919, the U.S. intelligence community viewed Garvey as sort of the greatest threat to the security of U.S. relations, white supremacy, sent out numerous informants into the organization, launched a years-long effort to figure out a way to incarcerate and deport Garvey. Right at the very beginning of the effort to do this, someone floats the idea that maybe we can get Garvey for mail fraud, which is exactly what they end up doing on very, very tenuous grounds. But it's funny, they had a lot of trouble because Garvey was very cautious and very careful, and sort of knew how to step up to the line without speaking in a way that could be construed as seditious in a legal sense, in a manner that would allow him, as a non-U.S. national, to be deported. But yes, this is how J. Edgar Hoover got started in the FBI.
And to the back to the Negro World, that particular paper, there were a lot of parts of Africa where that paper was illegal. It was banned, and yet people would still smuggle it in. Could you speak to what were some of the consequences at that time if you were in Francophone Africa and you were caught with a Negro World? What was the repercussions for somebody at that point?
Yeah, well, in French West Africa, that being caught with a Negro World was potentially punishable by death.
Wow.
Other people, other people were incarcerated for being caught smuggling the Negro World in. Like in the Caribbean, the Negro World was banned throughout most of Africa, and these stiff penalties were put upon it. But this didn't stop the flow of the Negro World into the continent. And the Garveyite organizers, people that were spreading the news, just got more creative. They would hide the paper inside other papers. Black people were working on ships all over the world, and they provide this distribution network. People had all these underground networks to spread the news. There's a famous story that Jomo Kenyatta, who became the first the president of Kenya, told CLR James. He said when in the early 1920s, copies of the Negro World would be smuggled into the ports of Kenya, and representatives from all around the country would be sent into Mombasa, into the port. And the first page of the Negro World, which was always Garvey's editorial, would be read a few times, and people would listen to it and they would memorize it. So they wouldn't be carrying the paper. And then they'd spread off back through the country to spread the word and to relay the message that had been sent by Garvey. This was happening all over Africa in different forms.
Wow, that's legendary, to say the least. So, I want to talk about something that you point out in your book, and I think it's another part. And I want to get into Garvey briefly on a global level, because as you know, and many others know, people like Ho Chi Minh would come to UNIA meetings. But you also pointed out something interesting, and honestly, it was my first time ever coming across this. Was about West Coast chapters of the UNIA, and how Japanese speakers, Indian speakers would be coming in, and they could actually speak at various UNIA chapters. Can you speak to the impact of Garveyism when it comes to politics that we may, in places we may not really suspect? Because like I said, when I read that, I was like, wow, you had people that, like I said, different groups like the Indians, Japanese people that were coming to these UNIA chapters. What is kind of like misunderstood in that particular aspect? Because I don't really hear about it a lot. We hear about his influence in Africa, but what was like that influence in Asia as well?
Yeah, well, Garvey's view of global politics was that Black people needed to organize, but also that colonial people all over the world were mobilizing. And he was influenced by Hubert Harrison again in this, right? This white supremacist Lothrop Stoddard wrote this book called The Rising Tide of Color right after World War I, and Lothrop Stoddard was aghast at this idea that white world supremacy would fall, because he was looking around. It's like, well, all these people in Asia and people in Africa and Black people in the United States are mobilizing, and white people better get together, or else this is going to be a problem. And Hubert Harrison wrote Stoddard this congratulatory letter being like, oh, I'm glad you see this. You all are in trouble. Like, we're coming for you. Yeah. And Garveyism very much projected this. The Negro World reported not only liberation struggles in the Black world, but in Asia as well. Garveyites, as you say, on the West Coast, but also Garvey himself was constantly trying to make contact with liberation movements in other parts of the world. Garvey, communicated with people like Gandhi, was in constant touch with other groups of people, because the UNIA identified the struggle as a struggle of Black people organizing, but also non-white people in general getting together and throwing off the shackles of world white supremacy. And this led to really interesting collaborations, including the ones you're talking about with Indian nationalists and Japanese nationalists and Chinese nationalists and people that are aligning against the colonial world and trying to find a path to gain strength in the pursuit of anti-colonialism.
So moving along, when we look at Garvey posthumously, I've seen some of the impacts. When you look at organizations like the Moorish Science Temple, many of the first adherents to that organization, including Timothy Drew, who would become Noble Drew Ali, was a Garveyite. Elijah Poole, who would become Elijah Muhammad, was a Garveyite. And like I said earlier in the podcast, Dr. Martin Luther King really spoke highly about Garvey's influence on him. Same thing with Malcolm X. So I want to talk about on two parts. The first part of this is, what is the impact of Garvey in Black nationalist movements after him in the United States, whether it may be in the manifestation of SNCC or other organizations? And then I'd like to talk about his influence on African leaders, after World War I as well. So the first part is in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, Garvey had a tremendous influence in the ways that you suggest, right? The Moorish Science Temple views Garvey as a prophet, sort of foretelling the coming of Noble Drew Ali. Malcolm X, who you mentioned before, grows up in a Garveyite household. Elijah Muhammad is a former Garveyite. Garveyism had a tremendous impact in general in shaping the Black Power movement. The way I think about Garvey, Garvey's message says something that is incredibly powerful and incredibly important. And it is that, it's sort of contained in this idea that you have to emancipate yourself from mental slavery. But Garvey's politics starts from the perspective that liberation for Black people requires recognizing that there is no path to power, there is no path to equality, without first recognizing that this is impossible within the United States as it currently stands. It is only possible by realizing that and then figuring out a way to mobilize Black power, mobilize collective power in a way in which Black people can then return to the bargaining table with that power, as in a way in which true relations of equality can be achieved. And that message of we need to recognize that what the United States is saying about including Black people in the project, what integrationists are saying about allowing Black people sort of into the American dream, like all these things, these are lies. And so long as as long as Black people believe that there is a place for Black people in America as it is currently constituted, Black people remain in mental slavery. And
Oh, I think you just got muted. I think did you unmute yourself? Hello? Speak. Can you hear me? Hold on, wait a minute. Okay, hold on. Technical difficulties. Hello. Let me see. All right, speak. What's going on? Hold on.
Hello.
Yeah, okay, we're back. Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me? Okay, hold on. What about now? Hello?
No.
What is going on? Okay, hold on. Let me. All right, you should be able to hear me now. Still can't hear me? Okay.
Can you hear me?
Okay. La. All right, can you hear me? Still can't? This sucks. All right, hold on. Let me see. Why am I not being heard? Hold on. Okay. Can you hear me now? Still can't? Okay. Let's see here. Go to more. No. Okay. Still can't hear me. Okay. Okay. This is weird. All right. Mute. Okay, I'm unmuted.
You can still hear me? I can't hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you. This is what I'm gonna do. Hold on. Can you see the, okay, so hold on. Okay, so I'm gonna just type them and so this is sorry for the technical difficulties, everyone. So you'll still be able to hear Dr. Ewing. I'm gonna type him the questions and then he'll be able to speak. And as I'm typing them, I'm gonna go ahead and state them as well. So hold on, let me put this here. So I know that Kwame Nkrumah is a figure that was influenced by Garvey, but what other African leaders were influenced by Garvey as well?
Yeah, so a number of African leaders were influenced by Garvey. Garvey's organization lasted long after Garvey's death. I mean, of course, Garvey's organization is still active. In 1957, the President General, Garvey died in 1940. In 57, William Sherrill, who was then the President General, traveled to Ghana to be part of the independence celebration, along with people like Martin Luther King and several other people. And as you say, Nkrumah was greatly influenced by Garvey. At that gathering, he told William Sherrill that of all the books that he'd read as a young man, the book that had the greatest influence on him was The Philosophy and Opinion to Marcus Garvey. But Sherrill was amazed to be approached by all of these different African leaders at the independence celebration who talked about the influence that Garveyism had on them. And other famous West African politicians like Nnamdi Azikiwe also said similar things about the influence of Garveyism. He became one of the early leaders of Nigeria. Another amazing story, in 1967, Garveyites actually established they established operations in Liberia, and the head of those operations, Clarence Harding, was invited by the Organization of African Unity to speak with a delegation in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And so Harding left Liberia and he traveled to the Congo, a place that Garveyism had played a really important role in influencing the emergence of the Kimbanguist Church. Which became a really important institution in the anti-colonial struggle in the Congo. Then he went to Kenya and he spoke with Jomo Kenyatta, who was a Garveyite as a young man and who really became one of the vectors for spreading Garveyite activism in Kenya. Then he traveled to Addis Ababa and the UNIA was given a non-voting role in the OAU, right. And Harding was both thrilled by this, but also frustrated that it had come at a time when the UNIA wasn't powerful enough to really have the impact that it would have had otherwise. But you can see the influence of the UNIA in Africa today in the flags, right? The flag of Malawi, which has the red, black, and green, in the black star on Ghana's flag. When I was doing research in Kenya, I stayed in an apartment that was near Marcus Garvey Road. The landscape itself reflects the influence of this movement. But one of the things that I really emphasize in my book is that Garveyism was all over sub-Saharan Africa in the 1920s and 1930s, and the nationalist sort of liberation generation that emerged after World War II contained people that had grown up in and been part of and had their political education forged by the Garvey movement.
So I want to do like a quick takeaway on Garvey. And, my question to you would be, and I'm going to have to type this because folks, if you're listening to this, Dr. Ewing can't hear me, so I'm going to have to type my questions. What would you say, of all of your years of researching Garvey, what's your most profound takeaway about Marcus Garvey and the impact of the UNIA? Like, if someone had to ask you, just in general, why is it important to study Marcus Garvey? what information or what insight would you provide them? So I'm going to go ahead and type this in. And sorry, Dr. Ewing, my screen, it's acting crazy. My screen is freezing. Hold on. Oh, this is crazy, guys. Hold on one moment. I'm so sorry. Okay. All right, here we go. So the question I asked, I said, if you, in your opinion, if one is interested in looking at key figures in liberation movements, why is it important to study Garvey?
I think Garvey is important for two reasons. You know, the first is that Garvey's message resonated through the world, and Garvey's message resonated through the decades. You know, liberation is about inspiring people to overcome the barriers that are put in place by those that seek to impress them, and to gain sort of the momentum and the courage to push through those barriers. And again, across the world and across the decades, Garvey's message inspired people to act and to mobilize and to fight for liberation. And it is incredibly important then to understand why that was the case. The second is that Garvey was dedicated more than anything else to organizing people to do just that, to bring about their liberation. And Garvey was, if nothing else, a genius at that, at mobilizing people, at inspiring them. I think any path toward liberation involves that type of that talent of inspiring people and that real commitment to organizing work. And I think that we can learn a lot of lessons from the Garvey movement. So again, both the message that Garvey projected, but also Garvey's commitment to building a powerful movement.
Wow. And Dr. Ewing, I want to thank you, although he can't hear me, but I want to thank you for talking about Garvey and your work. And I want anybody out here that's listening to this particular episode, make sure you go and get the Age of Garvey, powerful book. So I want to briefly switch the subject to STEM fields and the humanities. And so I'm going to send this question to Dr. Ewing and he's going to answer. And I'm rather verbose, so hold on, bear with me, people.
Well, look, history is power. You know, my favorite writers, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Afrocentrist Pan-African writer from Kenya, talks about the artist and the politician, and he says, you know, the politician, those with power, are interested in maintaining order, by which he means the status quo at all costs. The artist is interested in opening up the status quo to new possibilities, to new futures, right? And our status quo is one that is unequal. It is structured by racial inequality, and it is the interest of those with power to not allow us to see the possibility of something different. Yeah. History, like art, opens up the possibility of something different. It shows us how our society came to be, which means that it is not something that is inevitable, but something that is conditional on specific moments, specific power struggles. It also opens us up to the reality and the realization that other societies were living in different ways, organizing in different ways. It allows us to see different ideas about human society in the past as a way of building new societies in the future. African-American studies is absolutely critical to this pursuit because it centers the Black experience. And one of the major ideological propaganda efforts of the West, of the United States, is to deny the value of Black history, to deny that there is a Black history or a Black civilization separate from or of value to Western society. And by centering the Black experience, as African-American studies does, we better understand what our society is, but we also understand much better sort of what paths to liberation would look like. Because if you study people that have been immersed in this tradition, if you study the Black liberation tradition, you see all of these beautiful visions of what a better society would look like. And it is so important for students to understand that the present is not inevitable, that there is this long tradition of struggle. And so it is incredibly important, I think, for the ongoing effort to liberate Black people, to liberate oppressed people around the world, to focus on these things. And by the way, there's no reason why you can't study STEM and study African-American studies as well. A lot of our majors at BCU are double majors, and they study science and they study African-American studies. Because in every field that we learn, it is important to understand how that field looks when Black people are centered and Black experiences are centered, because the status quo is for those voices to be marginalized and denigrated. And so it doesn't have to be either or, but it is so important for us to continue these traditions and to learn our history.
Yeah, and that's one of my concerns when we have this push for constant commerce and kind of to acquiesce to this whole ideal of capitalism, if you will. Can you hear me again? That's not okay. But we cannot let this zeal or this fervor to always pursue money silence our story or make us remove ourselves from studying our history. And so I'm going to send this next question to Dr. Ewing as well. And the question is, and also the previous question was about STEM, because a lot of people are encouraging young people to go into STEM fields as opposed to the humanities, which African-American studies, history will fall under the humanities. So the next question, I'm going to say this out and then I'm going to send it to Dr. Ewing, is what advice would you have for a student interested in pursuing a career in African-American studies?
Oh, I would say you should do it. I mean, African-American studies gives students skills that are incredibly useful across a number of different professions. It provides students with a perspective about that really illuminates the society that we live in. It fosters critical thinking skills that are incredibly important and I think are only going to become more important as we move more and more into a data-driven society in which it is incredibly important to understand what information is usable, what information is useful, what information is true, what information is presented in good faith, and what information is is not presented in good faith, what information is meant to deceive. And so it's incredibly important to have these skills. But I think African American studies both sets students up for a number of really important sort of pursuits after they get through school, but also I think arms students for being active and engaged citizens.
Indeed. And I definitely agree. I think a lot of times we don't ignore the rigor that goes into synthesizing all of this various types of information, formulating different arguments, and just the acumen that's needed for proper historiography. I don't think we understand what really goes into producing a great work or a work such as the Age of Garvey. So the last question I'm going to send Dr. Ewing is ask him about what sort of projects or research he's currently working on. So I'm gonna go ahead and send this right now. Hold on.
So I'm still sort of doing work on Garveyism on the side. I'm really, the project that I'm working on, that I have been working on for a number of years, is I want to write a big history of Pan-Africanism that starts from the perspective of a popular Pan-Africanism, a Pan-Africanism of the people. A lot of the work that we see on Pan-Africanism is told through the lens of great figures in Pan-African history who, many of which have been mentioned in our discussion: Edward Wilmot Blyden, Henry McNeill Turner, Marcus Garvey, and Kwame Nkrumah, and on and on. And these are, of course, incredibly important figures. But I want to write a history that really puts this tradition of Pan-African liberation at the center of the story, particularly in the United States, where I think we really need to understand the period from World War I until the destruction of the Black Power movement in the early 1970s as a period of real revolutionary possibility, in which the grassroots traditions of Pan-African organizing came into their own, sought to overthrow global white supremacy. We still live with the after effects of that struggle, and I really want to try to tell that story and tell it from all over the world, like with the Age of Garvey. Talk about the story as it looks in London, in Europe. Talk about how it looks in places like Detroit, Michigan. How it looks in Jamaica with the rise of organizations like the Rastafari, religious groups. Yeah. That's what I'm working on long term.
Wow. Well, Dr. Ewing, I want to thank you for coming on today's episode. This was a privilege, and I think this was a powerful and extremely informative podcast. And so I can't wait to put this up and for people to actually hear this information, because I think people kind of have a general understanding of Garvey and Garveyism, but I think there was a lot shared on this particular episode that can definitely augment the perspective and the understanding that we have of not only Marcus Garvey, but the true impact of his movement. So let me go ahead and send this to Dr. Ewing real quick. And once again, make sure you guys are following me on Instagram at Hoyt, HOYT_Kwaku, KWAKU _Timmons, and also make sure you follow me on Instagram as well at _No Truths Barred Podcast. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel as well. And once again, thank you for checking out this episode. Take care and peace.
Thank you very much for having me. It's funny you asked me. It's funny you asked me about symposiums happening at VCU. Yes, we'll be hopefully doing some interesting work in the future. I was completely undone by that question because I feel like with COVID, I've just been so much, in a shell and at home, and the idea of sort of bringing people together feels like such a wonderful thing. But hopefully, we're going to be back on campus in the fall, and we'll be able to organize some more events like that moving forward.
Definitely. Well, listen, I know you're a busy scholar. I don't want to hold up any more of your time. Once again, thank you for coming on. I don't know, let me go ahead and type this as I'm saying it. Once again, thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much. Are we?
Yeah, we're finished. We're good. Okay, look, take care. Thank you so much. All right.
Oh, I just realized I could tell you. I just started to type out. It was really nice to talk to you. I'm sorry.
Oh,
sorry, the technical issues came in. Thank you for all of the questions. It's always fun for me to talk about Garveyism.
I will email you.
Okay.
Okay, take care. All right. Bye.